Welcome to the Deep Dive. I know you're here to really get into things thoroughly and quickly, and today we're going to do that with some pretty interesting patterns, I think.
Yeah.
We've got Shattuck, we've got Jetties, we've got Bales. These are kind of cool patterns that really, I think, illustrate some different design concepts. So this is kind of your shortcut to really understanding these concepts.
Yeah, and these are patterns that we're looking at from a source that describes them as tangles.
Okay.
And so what we're really going to be doing is kind of exploring these patterns, how they're constructed, what they look like, and also especially what the effects of shading are. Okay.
So let's dive into Shattuck. This is a pattern that I immediately, was kind of struck by as really versatile.
Mm-hmm.
It's described as pretty easy to draw. And you can see, even if you're not, an artist, I think you can see how this basic technique leads to something that's visually pretty captivating.
Yeah.
And especially when you get into, the shading.
Yeah, and I think one of the fascinating things about Shattuck is this technique of using auras. You're essentially drawing a series of lines that echo an initial line.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be a curved line, it could be a straight line.
Okay.
But you're maintaining, the same space between each echo, each aura.
So it's kind of like drawing a shape and then kind of like tracing it, slightly larger, slightly larger.
Yeah, and making sure that spacing is even.
Got it. And then the source talks about shading Shattuck, and there's some pretty interesting ways to play with this. So one is adding shadows to both ends of these narrow parallel lines that you've created, with these auras, and this gives it this kind of puffed, almost pillow-like texture.
Yeah, like the little segments are kind of rounded and have dimension to them.
Yeah, like if you were to just add a tiny highlight and shadow, you can make them kind of pop.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also talks about shading each individual element. So what's the effects of doing that?
Well, if you shade each, aurid section individually, you really start to emphasize the depth of each one.
Uh-huh.
And of course, you don't have to choose. You can combine these two. You can have both of them going on.
But just that idea that subtle changes in the way you approach the shading can give you such a different effect, I think is fascinating.
Right. It's kind of an aha moment when you see, how just this simple, repetitive technique can really be built up to create such visual interest.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good illustration of how fundamental techniques can, when applied thoughtfully and understanding light and shadow, can lead to really kind of sophisticated outcomes.
Okay, so let's move on to Jetties. This one I thought was interesting because it right off the bat, it kind of flags this as a drama pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And before we even get into the mechanics of how to draw it, I'm kind of curious what that even means. Like, what is a drama pattern?
Well, what they mean here when they say a drama pattern is the inclusion of these large areas of solid black ink.
Okay.
And the drama comes from the fact that against the white of the paper, it's this really stark contrast.
Okay, so it's literally just because you've got these big, bold, black areas.
Right.
Okay. So Jetties brings in this element of a lot of black. So how is the pattern itself constructed? It mentions spheres and curved lines.
Okay. So the first thing that you do when you're making jetties is that you fill, a section with spheres.
Okay.
And the key here is that the spheres are touching each other at their edges.
Okay.
And when you do this, you naturally create, gaps between them. And those are called voids.
Okay. So you've got this kind of network of circles all touching each other.
Right.
And then you've got these little empty spaces.
Right.
Okay. So what happens to the voids?
So then you fill those voids with smaller spheres.
Oh, okay.
So you've got another size sphere going on there.
Got it. Okay, so we've got these spheres. We've got big spheres. We've got little spheres.
Mm-hmm.
And then where do the curved lines come in?
Okay, so inside each of the spheres, and this includes both the large and the small spheres,
Okay.
you add something called banded arcs.
Mm-hmm.
And, and an important point here is that you should rotate the tile as you draw these arcs, so that they vary in direction. So
Yeah.
they're not all going in the same way.
Right. Right. So it's not too uniform.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting about this one is, just the description of filling a large section with this single pattern, one stroke at a time, and appreciating the contrast and how the ink flows.
Yeah.
It sounds very, I don't know, almost meditative in a way.
Yeah, and I think that's a key element in these kind of patterns is this kind of repetition and focus.
Mm-hmm.
Can be, really absorbing and allowing you to be very mindful of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And it includes, a little point here, which is that because of the fact that you are using these large areas of solid ink, you need to be mindful of the fact that they take longer to dry.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And to avoid smudging, which, if you smudge something, you can really mess up that contrast that you have.
Right.
But once you get, that basic form down, then you can start, playing with the idea of depth.
Oh, okay. So adding depth to these spheres.
Right. So there's, kind of a more advanced concept here with the jetties, and that is these overlapping overpasses.
Mm-hmm.
So in the basic form, all the spheres are kind of, drawn, so they're touching each other on their edges.
Right.
But once you feel comfortable with it, you can introduce the idea of depth and draw some of these spheres as if they were behind others. So they're kind of passing over them.
Like literally one sphere looks like it's behind another sphere.
Right. And it adds, another dimension to it and makes it a little less flat.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's cool how you can like kind of evolve that pattern as you get better.
Mm-hmm.
So now what about shading jetties? How does that work with all these spheres and these bold black areas?
Well, because jetties has both, individual elements,
Mm-hmm.
the spheres, but also can create this kind of unified texture across an area. There are a couple of different ways you can approach the shading.
Right.
One way is you can shade each sphere individually.
Okay.
And that can give them a three-dimensional look,
Mm-hmm.
make them feel more tangible.
Mm.
And then you can also, create a more overall puffed shading effect.
Okay.
Across the whole area of the jetties pattern.
So like you're treating that whole area
Yeah.
as one element basically.
Is one thing.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And then the way you shade it will kind of, I guess, emphasize one perspective or the other, whether it's this kind of field of spheres,
Yeah.
or whether it's this kind of more textured, solid area.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to our final pattern, which is bales. This is described as infinitely variable, and it's inspired by a classic fabric design. And that just kind of immediately makes me think about its adaptability.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's inspired by a classic fabric design, points to the long history and inherent, kind of visual appeal of this kind of pattern.
Right.
And they mention that you might even, recognize these kinds of visual tones from everyday life.
Yeah.
So that's something to kind of keep an eye out for after this deep dive.
Right.
But we're going to focus in on the basic version of bales.
Okay.
Just so we understand, kind of the core structure of it.
Got it. And bales is a grid-based pattern. So we're starting with that kind of structure, and it's actually similar in its base structure to floors.
Right.
So why start with a grid? Like, what does that framework offer?
Well, the grid provides that fundamental kind of structure and regularity to the pattern, and so it acts as a kind of a guide to ensure that when you're doing the subsequent steps, that there's a consistent kind of spacing and alignment to what you're doing.
So that initial grid could be straight lines, could be curved lines.
Right. And they do recommend, if you're practicing, that you use straight lines.
Yeah.
Just because it's, clear and regular and you can really see how the pattern works.
Yeah.
But they also point out that, once you get more comfortable with it, drawing the grid with curved lines would also be something that you could play with.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so we've got this grid. Now, what's the next step in building the Bales pattern?
So once you've established the grid, you draw kind of soft curved arcs on both sides of each grid segment.
Okay.
And the arcs are consistently curved in the same direction along each segment. And they use the description rice grain shapes.
Oh, okay.
So you can kind of visualize what that looks like.
Right.
And then, so once you've done that, for all the segments going, in one orientation, you then rotate your tile and repeat the process, on the newly oriented segments.
And you're still drawing those rice grain shapes in that same direction.
Right. So it's almost like you're weaving
right.
these shapes across the grid.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Okay, and then it talks about adding an inner aura to each tile section. So what's that about?
So adding that inner aura to each of the grid squares or sections you've created just refines the individual elements and gives them a little bit more definition.
Okay.
Within the overall pattern.
So it kind of separates them a little bit.
Right.
Okay.
And makes the individual forms stand out a little bit more.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And now Bales introduces this concept of a meta pattern.
Yeah.
And this is something that is not deliberately drawn. It's kind of like emerges from the process.
Yeah.
So what is that, and what's an example of that in Bales?
Right. So so they point to the fourth step of the instructions here, and you'll often notice in the fourth step circles forming, where multiple of those curved strokes intersect.
Okay.
So you never drew a circle,
right?
But the way that the rice grain shapes overlap and interact with each other, kind of naturally creates the suggestion of circular forms at those intersections.
Yeah.
And that is a meta pattern, a visual element that arises organically from the application of the core pattern's rules.
So that's fascinating that you get these hidden patterns that kind of appear.
Yeah.
It's very geometric.
Right.
Okay, so now how do we approach shading Bales to bring out its best qualities?
Okay, so similar to Shattuck and Jetties, you have some options here. You could shade the entire Bales pattern, as a whole,
right?
And that would create an overall sense of depth or dimension, suggesting a light source and how it falls across this woven structure.
Right.
And then you could also choose to shade each individual element, so each of those little rice grain shapes, or the aura within the grid sections, to emphasize them separately. But they do mention that in the demo tile, the shading is applied at the intersections.
Right.
And so this technique really highlights those overlapping areas and interestingly, emphasizes that flower-like meta pattern, those emergent circles that we talked about.
Yeah.
And so it brings out, this kind of hidden structure.
Yeah. It's cool how the shading, the way you choose to shade it, will bring out a different aspect. Like you might not even see that meta pattern.
Right.
Unless you shade it in a certain way.
Right. And it's not, the shading isn't, just about making it look darker.
Right.
It's really a tool for highlighting and interpreting, these underlying forms and relationships within the pattern.
Right.
And guiding the viewer's eye and revealing those subtle complexities.
So I think we've really kind of done a pretty deep dive here into Shattuck, Jetties, and Bales.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me how each pattern has this unique construction. These different shading possibilities.
Yeah.
And they just offer such a different visual outcome.
Right.
You've got Shattuck, with those simple auras and that kind of versatile shading and creating that sense of organic layering. You've got Jetties, with that dramatic use of the ink.
Yeah.
And that potential to create, depth through overlapping.
Right.
And then you've got Bales, with this grid-based structure and those surprising emerging meta patterns.
Right.
And I think it really shows how, how complexity can arise from, kind of simple steps.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
each one gives you this different lens, I think, to kind of look at this art form
Hmm.
and explore different visual principles.
And hopefully you, our listener, have gained a, quick but thorough, kind of understanding of these
Oh,
techniques,
yeah.
and maybe even had a few aha moments along the way,
Yeah.
and can see, not just the how, but also maybe a little bit of the why. These patterns are so engaging.
So I guess as you go about your day to day, just consider how these concepts might apply to other things you're working on, or even just understanding layers of information or layers of meaning
Mm-hmm.
in your own field. So that idea of auras from Shattuck, that kind of echoing and layering,
Mm-hmm.
could the concept of a drama pattern, with that bold use of contrast,
Yeah.
inspire you to bring focus to different aspects of your projects or your communications?
Huh.
And then finally, just be on the lookout for meta patterns, these unexpected structures or insights that might emerge from a seemingly straightforward process.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll
Yeah.
see you next time.